Hi, I'm Annette Markham, and I'm a professor and digital ethnographer at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I've been studying digital culture since around the mid 1990s, and I often focus on how people make sense of how identities, bodies, and social formations are mediated through various digital technologies. In the past 10 years, I've been doing a lot of experiments to combine concept mapping, mood boarding, and Adele Clark's situational analysis and situational mapping techniques to have participants produce layers of relations and connections and flows and affect and agency to understand network culture. And in that, I've been practicing using different metaphorical starting points to highlight particular aspects of situations and experiences. Taking a platform sensibility, for example, helps my students focus attention on the features of the platform, the default parameters, the possibilities, and the constraints within or maybe across different apps. On the other hand, taking a network sensibility to look at digital lived experience brings attention to the idea that any moment or object that we focus on can be considered a node in a much larger and dense network of potentially relevant relations and connections. Taking a geographic sensibility to map one's moods in a physical space or one's relationships with a platform in a digital space, for example, generates yet another different set of meanings. Drawing maps as feelings and emotions, for example, takes this microscopic detail of everyday life and emotions and explodes it out into this terrain, a landscape view. This is something that I've been doing annually since around 2012 to help young adults think about building layers or strata in unpacking and making sense of their locally and globally distributed and networked digital lives. For today's panel, we're zooming in on two particular techniques. So I'll start by reflecting very briefly on how I used situational mapping and allegorical mapping as part of a large-scale project across 26 different countries with 165 different researchers um, to make sense of the early pandemic lockdowns and the intersections of the massive and the microscopic. And then Riccardo will talk about doing allegorical mapping in teaching university students to think about their relationships with platforms and data and algorithms in his work in Italy. In early 2020, I organized and facilitated a project called Massive and Microscopic Sensemaking to explore the intersections of scale being experienced in this moment of early pandemic related lockdowns. And many people in lockdowns were suddenly isolated, restricted in their physical range, yet feeling the sensation of being deeply connected with this planetary level phenomenon. And of course, not everyone was experiencing this phenomenon in the same way. Yet there was still a feeling that we were in it together as a planet. 165 people from 26 countries participated in um, what I created as 21 days of autoethnographic prompts with my colleague Dan Harris from RMIT University. The idea was to allow people to explore in their own time and ways um, different modalities and methods for making sense of what this urgent and deadly and unknown virus meant, but also how this moment in history was being lived in our bodies, in homes, in ways both deeply familiar and strange. The digital entanglement was quite striking. Not just in the evidence of continuous doom scrolling and the virality of certain trends, but also in the oscillating of physical and digital, a blurring and sharpening of the distinctions of online and offline, local and global, physicality and sociality. Part of the massive and microscopic experience involved situational and allegorical mapping. And the focus was to build visualizations of relations and connections between elements and situations, starting from a central image, idea, action, or question. A range of different imaginaries just sort of poured out of people as they generated maps of their bodies, conversations, situations, feelings, patterns, repetitions, boundaries. They also mapped their emotional geographies using emotion mapping, allegorical mapping techniques, and these were beautiful in a range of ways. And there's so much more to this project, but in the interest of time, I'll stop here. You can read more about this project by searching for massive and microscopic sense-making online, or we'd be happy to share links. And now I'll let Riccardo pick up on what he later did with this method of focusing on allegorical maps.
In 2020, I was one of the people who participated in the Micromassive project. And afterward, I realized I could use allegorical and situational maps in my teaching as well as my PhD project to explore the relationships between users and data. So I adopted Annette's critical pedagogy approach to investigate and help 40 university students explore their taken for granted relationships with digital platforms. In my experience, maps could help participants materialize the microscopic details of their relationships with digital environments and help me understand what's going on here. First, participants created allegorical maps. Through these, we were generating what researchers Jones and Harris in 2016 defined as territories of the self. Mapping helped students consider the relationships between body, space, and emotions. Students also created situational maps using methods akin to concept mapping. Here, they explored the human and non-human elements involved in a powerful, emotionally charged moment on digital media and the different scales that Annette Markham was citing before. These mapping exercises centralize the body. That is, they focus on building understanding of situations from the self, the site where our feelings and therefore emotional geographies first developed. These maps also privilege movement. That is, they trace boundaries and emotional spaces between things. They visualize the flow of micro and macro interactions shaping these emotional spaces. For us, as STS scholars focused on sense-making practices in data-saturated cultural context, the outcomes of our experiments illustrate how the digital and emotional are deeply entwined and can be visually depicted or expressed through a geographic sensibility through mapping. In other words, what emerged from both Annette's massive macro project in 2020 and my own later teaching experiences are representations of digital emotional geographies or emotional geographies of the digital. Annette and I spent some time together in Australia in 2022, focusing on the maps my students had produced in Italy, and these were exhibited in Melbourne, Australia. In the exhibition, I highlighted moments where the friction between the massive and the microscopic was most clearly depicted. Mostly, this happened when people felt the most intensely. This may be frustration about spending time, perceived as too much time on platforms, or anxiety about their own indecision, or moments of profound boredom. And these moments also illustrate the intersections of the self and other actors and agents that impact everyday online experiences.
Tess Osborne and Phil Jones write in 2023 that today the spaces where our geographies of emotion take shape are inherently digital. They have become an assemblage of material, social, and digital processes. The maps you've been viewing on the screen are fragments of these types of assemblages, snapshots of temporarily situated engagements, frozen for a moment. Of course, this sort of freezing or rendering might lead to oversimplification, but it also usefully externalizes, visibilizes these assemblages, and each iteration produces a slightly different version. We find this has great value for exploring what might be salient at the intersection of the emotional, the digital, and the self other relations. It pulls up new elements in global networks of flow that can be inspected and introspected, I suppose. In our own work, these techniques of creative and iterative mapping have helped us and our participants explore micro and macro agencies, empower, empower relations, alongside the tensions and contradictions of emotional engagements with platforms. We hope they've been somewhat inspirational for you as well today. Thanks very much.